Hey everyone, Avatar Guy here. I wanted to just go over this new article that came out that kind of highlights Avatar's impact on the industry, has some really interesting facts. That's probably where the clickbait title came from of over 1,000 versions or hundreds of thousands of hours to create. So let's jump right in. This is the article. I'll drop a link to it in the description so you can read the full thing yourself. It's really, really cool. There's a lot of really interesting facts. A lot of them go over my head, but let's just kind of dive in together and see what there is. Um, First of all, just some background. There was this thing called the HPA Tech Retreat, and it's the Hollywood Professional Association's Tech Retreat. 4 days of discussion about where the industry is going, and the entire second day was dedicated to Avatar, namely Avatar: The Way of Water. And so much of this article covers that. So let's kind of get down to that Tuesday. So there was different presentations given by different members of the crew, producer John Landau, who we all know, and that they break it down into all these different elements. So the first session they had during the day was this panel interview with key members of the production and post-production team, Robin Charters, the 3D canvas engineer, Russell Carpenter, Tashi Trejo, the colorist, and Simon Marsh, camera specialist. So first off, we have Russell Carpenter, and he talked about the massive efforts in principal photography, which is them shooting the movie, and that the movie is, as we all know, almost entirely CG, and that they started work on the movie pre-production all the way back in 2013. So just to put that into perspective for everyone, I know most of you who are following know this already, but for those who don't, Avatar 2 and 3 started pre-production in 2013. So 9 years of work that has gone into this. And Russell starts with this really great quote of, "We don't know how to make it." It's from James Cameron. "We don't know how to make it, but we'll know how we made it after we made it," which is kind of strange when you think about it, but it worked out in the end. And that it was built like a cake, a layer cake, and the second layer being built before the first layer was even done. So the production was very liquid the entire time. So, and interestingly, they did script writing and production design. So they were writing the story at the same time as they were designing the world itself, which isn't that common in Hollywood or the movie making business. And then they do all that design. 2017 comes around, and that's when they do the performance capture. That's when I think what most people would think about when they consider actual movie making starts happening. They have real people, there are something resembling cameras, and they're recording them doing the performance. And that's where he talks about this here, that they had to do this twice. So they did the original recording when they did the performance capture, and then they did the second recording of the real live action actors. And that a huge amount of this was tying those two things together. So bringing the CGI along with the live action, so the real people, and merging them together. And that they then talk about this camera system, which I think I'm going to dive into, which I think is really cool. So they talk about how a large part of the challenge in cinematography was the development of a camera system that could handle stereoscopic shooting at high resolution while being light enough to be maneuverable by a single operator. And this is where Simon Marsh comes into the picture, who's the camera guy. So they talk about him, and that they basically put this challenge to Sony, who developed the camera system, to try and make something that's very light and has all these capabilities, 48 frames per second, but that they also need the sensor block separate from the camera. And as I understand it, the sensor block seems to be the thing that is actually like picking up everything that's being sent to the camera itself, and so usually they're very close together. And they manage to separate them apart to try and make it much less heavy, so Jim can handle it like he's doing in this image here. So that's again, they're pushing the physical limits of what a camera can do in the making of these movies. It's like almost classic James Cameron. Another interesting thing, which I had to research this myself, was they talk about this thing called 2500 ISO. And my understanding is that the ISO is how much light the camera captures, so how sensitive to light the camera is, and that the higher the ISO number, the more light it can capture. And so he says here that because these cameras that they were given had a really good dynamic range, they were capturing a lot of the light, and the performance was really good from his perspective, was that at the high ISO, what would have normally required 100-foot Lamberts only required 20. It enabled him to perfectly match the lighting of the live action character Spider with his virtual co-stars, right down to the dappling of tree foliage. And so it seems like they didn't have to use such bright lights because the cameras were more sensitive to that light. That's kind of what I get from this anyway. I'm sure if I'm wrong, someone will jump in and please do correct me. And then they talk about Spider at great length in this, and I think Spider's obviously is one of the most interesting things in the film, but from a technical perspective, talking about how they had to integrate him seamlessly into the movie, and that was one of the most complex things. That lining up his eye line, what they had to do was they had little cameras that zoomed around and the little screens that zoomed around, so that when Jack Champion was older and filming his scenes in live action, he had the correct eye line for the roles and the shots that he was actually shooting. As with the previous movie as well, his mask was CGI because otherwise it would be reflecting everything that they were actually filming rather than the tundra and flora, etc., of Pandora. And then goes on to talk about this huge water tank, 900,000 gallons of water, that it could create 10-knot currents and 2-meter waves, and that they use large modified earth movers were used to generate the waves, while a powerful pump generated the currents. And the current was necessary to create accurate and plausible motion capture as the actors swam against it. Jim's not out here wanting to do the fake water swimming that we've seen in other movies. And then the other interesting thing in this section is this bit here where, to show fire against the water, instead of putting screens under the water or on the waterline, which was dangerous and didn't look good, they put mirrors in the water and then reflected fire off of those mirrors to make it look like the fire was on the water surface, which I thought was a really cool way of getting around that particular problem. Next is someone called Tashi Treyu. I hope that's how it's pronounced. And that they talk about how a lot of very technical things about the things like DaVinci Resolve and the tools that they actually used on creating the film. But one thing that stood out for me was this here, and I think it's one of the things that a lot of people noticed too. That, and I'll read it. James Cameron says, an important concern to James Cameron in the grading process was that the water held its volume. A lot of time was spent working on the saturation and increasing gamma so that elements didn't feel like they were floating in space, but instead were suspended in substantive ocean water. And I think that really paid off. I think that when you watch the movie, you really do feel like you're looking through water itself. It doesn't look like you're watching someone floating with no medium separating you and the characters. It's that level of immersion. And then the next bit that I thought was amazing as well was that they talk about the 3D, that all of the work was done in 3D and that the cutting was done in 3D. So, and that this person was doing all this work in 3D and didn't get eye strain. They kind of talk about whether that was the fact that Dolby was being used and alleviated the eye strain. But the thing was that, I don't know, that he talks about, and this is it, he attributes this largely to Jim Cameron's belief that when cutting 3D, the subjective interest should almost always be placed at the screen plane, so that the viewer's eyes focus and converge at the same distance. In typical 3D viewing, the human eye is often led to focus in front of or behind the screen, forcing the eyes to converge at a different distance to their focus. So that's kind of, I think, when like a sword comes out of the screen, or that like something's too deep into the screen, that kind of gimmicky 3D, that isn't something James Cameron uses, and that helps prevent eye strain. I don't know whether that's true or not. I mean, certainly for me, I'd never experienced it while watching any of James Cameron's 3D conversions. Watching some of the cheaper 3D, I can feel, definite eye strain there. And maybe this is the reason and why for A2 it hasn't really seemed to have been a problem. And then there's this quote here as well. Another quote from James Cameron is that if there's something that takes 10 seconds, you'd better figure out how to shave off 9 seconds of that time before showing it to Jim. So you need to be effective and efficient. Robin Charters then appears and talks about how they had to build these. They basically built everything and bought it. So they either bought the things they were going to use, the tools they were going to use, or they built them themselves, because they knew that the production of the movie was going to go on so long that if they rented them, it wasn't going to be cost effective. So they literally, all of this stuff is theirs to use. And then it goes on to discuss that the team created their own assembly space, the Coral Circle Skunk Works, down the road from the Manhattan Beach studio, complete with everything from CNC mills to custom SoC development boards. I'm not sure what the SoC development boards are, but I assume it's to do with like actual making these cameras. And that they all built these custom stereoscopic underwater rigs, and as well as traditional rigs, traditional cameras, but they actually built them themselves. And then there's this next section here which really interests me, was that that they tested loads of monitors before putting them in front of James Cameron, because obviously they want it to be really, really good quality, but that they also didn't want any latency. And let me get this clear. It was that when they're filming in the virtual space, they have the CG the lower resolution or lower quality CG version on the screens, and that they didn't want any latency between when he was filming and what he was seeing on his little screen, to such an extent that, and then there's this final line here, is that this was so religiously followed that the crew would actually turn monitors upside down to avoid hitting a frame rate buffer needed to invert the image digitally. So instead of just doing a process within the software to make the image go upside down, they would literally just turn the screen upside down, because it meant that the latency was lower, because they didn't have to go through that added barrier of turning it upside down. This next bit is extremely I don't understand anything about this, that they go over the technical specifications of the cameras and things like that. The one that I liked, though, was that this last bit is that, lastly, Robin's team had a hard time sourcing 3D preview monitors. The stereoscopic home theater craze had run its course, and it was impossible to find any newly manufactured stereo monitors. Finally, they discovered that a medical division of Sony still made a 3D monitor for surgery that was available for purchase. So there you have it. They were using surgery monitors for the production of Avatar, which kind of makes sense given that James Cameron works with surgical precision. Maybe that's a bad joke, I don't know. And then John Landau. A highlight of the sessions was a video calling from legendary producer John Landau. And he, as we all know, he's Jim's right-hand man, and he went over some really interesting things here, that they talk about the importance of 48 frames per second, and that they've been testing this for a long time. They knew they wanted to do a higher frame rate, push that boundary, but they wanted to get it right. And so one of the things that they did was they realized that it was going to be something like variable frame rate. And then he highlights these four key areas that he thinks Avatar 2 has pushed filmmaking technology forward. So underwater performance capture, we all, I think, very aware of that. Never been done like this before. Water simulation advancement. The Weta guys have done an amazing job on that. There's been so many amazing videos out there on those. Facial capture and performance, and then real-time depth compositing system. And so I think that this real-time depth compositing system is what he says is the biggest leap forward, because and this is putting the visual effects in the screen in real time, so that they can kind of see it on the screen when they're filming. And that integration of those visual effects while filming is going to be extremely useful for nearly anyone that makes movies. And that, again, that these were born out of the post-mortem they did on Avatar 1. What didn't work so well and what worked, better, one of the things was that they used that time to realize and to improve this. They talk about the water again, which is really cool. The amount of R&D that Weta have used, and then they go into the editing of the movie. And there's another article that goes really in depth on that. If you haven't seen that, where it's an actual talk with Jim and the editors of the movie, and it's, again, that's also mind blowing. I'll also leave a link to that in the description as well. This kind of final bit was this final bit of this section blew my mind. Right, was that when processing it, they used 3.3 billion core hours of rendering on the cloud for AWS. That was only with the rendering they did in the cloud. It wasn't even the rendering that they did on their own server farms. So if we only use that, 3.3 billion hours is just over 376,000 years, which is how long it would take you to render Avatar 2 at least on a single core, which is insane when you think about it. And it's probably far more than that, maybe double that, like 600,000 years, 700,000 years, maybe a million years on a single core, depending on how much of their own rendering that Weta did on their own servers. And then right at the bottom is where we get to this kind of final one, is that when they were sending Avatar out to theaters, they were really mindful of making sure that everyone got the best theatrical experience on the theater that they could see it on. And that as a result of that, they put out 1,065 different builds of the movie. And that they talk about here, color and contrast were evaluated for the different screen brightness and aspect ratios to ensure that every local cinema had an optimal viewing experience. By the time all of the various subtitles were added, there were 6,338 total deliverables. So I think that really puts into perspective how much effort and, passion these people put into this. Especially given that, I don't know, that they really, really want everyone, no matter where you are, whether you're watching it in Dolby Vision or watching it, probably in a very rural location with not such a great screen, they want you to still get the best visuals possible. And that shows, I think, a real reverence and respect for the audience and filmmaking as a craft, which I wouldn't expect anything less from James Cameron. For me, the biggest takeaways from this article were, one, just the amount of sheer effort and complexity that's gone into making these movies. I don't think that I can truly wrap my head around it. And it's also one of the reasons why I think that it hasn't been nominated for as many awards as it should have, because I think other people also haven't been able to wrap their head around the complexity and magnitude of these movies. Secondly, just the number of versions, over 1,000 different versions of the movie. I mean, they're the same story and you're seeing pretty much the same thing, but that's a lot of versions. And then third, just the amount of hours. When you think about all the hours that people worked on this, there's like, I think 3,800 people worked on it, and then all the processing hours that also went into it. I feel like it's not a stretch to say that over 1 million years of effort has gone into this movie, and I think it shows. And I think that its success also shows that. I mean, it's been rewarded. Overall, yeah, I just thought this is a really good article. I encourage you all to read it. Also, the other one that I'm going to link in the description. As always, I want to thank you. No, actually, as always, I want to thank the Based and Robust Network, and I want to thank you for watching.